Hello and welcome to this edition of The Interview on France 24. I'm Robert Parsons. We're just a few days away from the final round of a French presidential election that many here are describing as the most important in decades. It's an election in which the issues of immigration and the compatibility or otherwise of Islam with French cultural values have played a prominent, some might say leading role. Who better then to discuss those issues than my guest today? Gilles Kepel, one of France's most distinguished experts on the Islamic and Arab world. He's professor at the Paris Institute for Political Sciences and director of the Middle East and Mediterranean chair at the PSL Research University. And his most recent book, first published in French in November 2015, is just about to be published in English under the title Terror in France, The Rise of Jihad in the West. Gilles Kepel, thanks very much for being with us on the interview today.
My pleasure.
If I could just begin with looking at one of the central theses in your book, the idea that jihadist groups like the Islamic State organization are trying to provoke a reaction by their terrorist attacks in France and elsewhere in Europe to create a split between Europe of the West and the Islamic world.
Definitely, and also to create a split within Europe between its population from Muslim descent and the rest of the European population. And this is very well documented. This was written in the manifestos of this third generation jihadism way back into mid-2000s. And they had really wanted to take hostage the French presidential and parliamentary elections, which are going to follow, because they thought that the more attacks there are, the more votes the extreme right will get in reaction to that, and the more that will feed into the extremist discourse. And therefore, Muslims will feel attacked, will feel under threat, and will cling to the right, to the extremists, and will gather under the banner of the terrorists. And this is what they had in mind. And this is what people were really afraid of when there was this last attack in the Champs-Élysées Thursday before the first round.
But I suppose you could argue that they're failing in that sense.
Definitely. And this was a big issue that French intelligence was actually able to nip in the bud many of the other plots that had been conducted and to foil most of them. Because we had 239 people dead in between the Charlie Hebdo attack in January 2015 and the stabbing of Catholic priest Jacques Hamel in July 26. But since then, and until the unfortunate stabbing of a policeman in Champs-Élysées, the 3 days before the first round, nothing happened in France. Not that nothing had been planned. On the contrary, scores of people were arrested because telephones were tapped, because the codes for Telegram and other messenger services were broken. Yeah. And therefore, much of the attacks switched to other countries like Germany or Britain or Sweden, where the police forces were less accustomed to fighting this type of jihadi terrorism.
But as you say, the attacks over the years are having a big impact on French society because of the laws that are being introduced, state of emergency and so on and so forth. It impacts on French society. There must be a big fear during this election that it could have a big impact on the outcome of the election as well.
Definitely, and the fact that Marine Le Pen's hopes are aiming at something like 14% of the votes in the runoff definitely derived to a large extent from this terrorist threat on the part of the jihadists. Remember that when her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was present at the second round of the presidential election in 2002 against Jacques Chirac, he totaled 17% of the votes. Yeah. Now the polls show that she may get more than twice that amount. And this is, of course, linked not only to the fact that there is this jihadi threat, and she's using a lot of attacks on immigrants, on people, and on the place of Islam in France to boost her popularity. But this is also due to the fact that, the social situation in France is not great. that unemployment towers at something like 10%, and in the so-called banlieue...
Well, this is what I'd like to ask you next. To what extent do you think does French public policy, over not just the last few years, but over decades, bear responsibility for the rise of extreme Islam in France?
Well, when you have something like 40%, 40, of the youth in the banlieues or in the outskirts of the big cities, which are populated largely by children of immigrants coming from North Africa or former French West Africa, most of them being Muslims, this, of course, leads to a serious problem, because when you're unemployed, when your possibility to make a living is largely due to either to be on welfare or to do drugs, therefore you have this sort of feeling that you do not belong to French society, and this led in turn to the thriving of Salafism, this understanding of Islam that considers that there's a cultural break between true Islam on the one hand and apostates, i.e. bad Muslims on the other hand, and infidels, which is the rest of society. And even though Salafis in general are non-violent, nevertheless, ideologically, they are the breeding ground of the jihadi groups. And this is, of course, there is this mix between the social problem and the radical dimension, which is at the core of the difficulty that we're facing.
Marine Le Pen, the head of the Front National, the National Front in France, one of the candidates in the second round of the election, blames decades of bad rule from the government in France. She says she has the answers. She comes out with slogans like, "This is our home," and threatens to expel hardline teachers, radical preachers, close mosques, and so on and so forth. Does she, in any sense at all, have the right answers, do you think?
Well, this is a normative answer, of course, that I would not make, but definitely many people don't believe that this is the answer, that it's not the expulsion of foreigners that will bring back jobs to France, and it's not the pullout, Frexit, as she says, of the pullout of France from the European Union that will also improve the economic issue in France. Quite the contrary. I guess that the big issue definitely is when we want to deal with this this problem of radicalism and Islamism and jihad in the banlieues, is first and foremost to fix our education system. Because when you get out of school, you don't have a job, then the values which are correlated with that job, liberty, equality, freedom, secularism, are thrown away, just like the baby is thrown away with the bathwater. And then, and I guess that this is one of the big challenges of the next president, whether it be Emmanuel Macron, who has tried
let me put you on the spot with that. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that Emmanuel Macron does indeed win the election. What does he have to do to prevent this progressive division of French society?
Well, fixing the education system is a top priority. Then reforming the justice system is also a huge issue, because, the prisons in France have been the major incubator of jihadism. Radicals who were put in jail started to proselytize amongst, petty criminals, and most of the attacks that took place in France, the most violent attacks, were performed by people who had spent years and years in French prisons.
It'll take more than penal reform, won't it?
Absolutely. This means building jails, and it means also, finding a way for prisons to bring correction and not incorrection. So this is a big issue. The third thing, which is the hot potato in French politics, is that you have to reform the welfare system and make the economy more fluid so that it can recruit. And therefore...
And is Islam compatible with French cultural values, with La République?
Well, depending which Islam, of course. When you're a Salafi or a jihadist, you're not interested in French values, or you just want to smash them open. But when, for the vast majority of Muslims who chose to come here and who are our co-citizens, there is no problem. And the big issue for jihadists is to try to recruit this majority of French Muslim and or European Muslims who don't want to hear about them, who are ashamed of them, who don't want to follow them. But then, you know, the more they have those provocative attacks, the more the extreme right rises, whether it's in France, in Germany, with the Alternative for Deutschland, and so on and so forth, or in the Netherlands, then the more they think those Muslims will feel alienated.
Okay, one last question, because we're coming near to the end of the interview. I'd like you to gaze into your crystal ball. Michel Houellebecq, very well-known French author, wrote a book fairly recently called Submission, in which he predicted, more or less, that in 2022, a Muslim traditionalist party would be ruling the country. Where do you see France going over the next few years?
Well, it's a great novel, but it's fiction, right? And I believe that and fictional work is usually some sort of wake-up call, so as to see reality in an exaggerated manner, so that you can cure social ills. And I guess that this is a big warning for the forthcoming French election.
And that, I'm afraid, is all we have time for today. Thanks very much to our guest, Gilles Kepel, whose book, Terror in France, is coming out in English later this month. That's all we have time for. Goodbye for now. Thanks to the viewers.
Middle East Matters, presented by Sanam Chantier.
Keep up to date on the latest from the Middle East. We bring you political, economic, and cultural events from the region in this weekly Middle Eastern program.
Middle East Matters on France 24 and France24.com.